Welcome to All Systems Ergo, a human factors and ergonomics podcast delving into the fascinating world of healthcare. My name is Fran Ives and I am a chartered human factors specialist. I'm naturally curious about people, and throughout this series I want to explore different areas of healthcare human factors and the people who work in this diverse discipline. Hi everyone and welcome to today's episode. I'm really pleased to be speaking to three guests today and explore how they built up a human factors service from scratch. So I'm delighted to welcome Jo McCloud, a colorectal surgeon at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust, Pete Jeffries, patient safety specialist at the same trust, and last but not least, Lauren Morgan, a human factors specialist from Morgan Human Systems. So welcome to you all today.
Morning.
So those of us who are interested in or work in human factors in healthcare know that there's an ever-growing number of staff who are learning about human factors and developing their skills and knowledge. But there are still very, very few healthcare organisations that employ qualified human factors specialists. Now, Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust, or SATH as it's known, is one such trust. That post is still relatively new, and I know that Pete and Jo, you were instrumental in creating that role, so I want to explore that a little bit further. So firstly, Pete, what was the driver for creating that post?
So I came to SATH in, I think it was about 2018, as an associate director role that kind of covered patient safety. And I guess having left West Midlands Patient Safety Collaborative based with the HM, and having been exposed and tried to push a lot of HF&E stuff via the PSC, I very much had it in my head that I wanted to advocate that we built HF&E skills at SATH. And part of the way the job was kind of pitched to me was, look, there's a lot of mention of assurance here, but actually what we're looking for is we want somebody who's interested in culture and pushing patient safety forward. So I was like, great, that sounds like a real opportunity. But I guess I landed at a point where it's fair to say, chaos descended on the organisation, and it was an extremely difficult place. So you'd had the maternity scandal had hit the news, and we were rated as inadequate by the CQC. So the organisation was in a really difficult place, and I think. We were just talking about this a minute ago. I think even though I'd worked in acute trust for a long time, and having worked at the PSC, I thought I really understood the challenges there were going to be to try and really kind of push and embed human factors and ergonomics thinking. I think I was still quite naive almost. I felt like I was going in with my eyes open, but I completely underestimated how much of a challenge that was, and I think that challenge is then doubled or trebled by the fact you're going into an organisation that's in such difficulties. So it was a long and torturous journey, but it became a bit of a double-edged sword in some ways because the organisation was so under the cosh, and with that comes the fact that you end up with quite a kind of rotating cast of senior leaders and directors as well, so you don't really have any kind of consistency of leadership. So people who you've been kind of talking to and kind of trying to influence are suddenly not there anymore, so you have to restart. But I started to get a bit of kind of headway with the director that I was reporting to at one point, who had some interest. And it just so happened we had an NHS Improvement Director in the organisation at that point, and I happened to catch that NHS Improvement Director as we were leaving a meeting and just kind of collared them and said, actually, look, I think there's a real opportunity here, and you might not appreciate this, but actually the general baseline in terms of HF&E stuff in the NHS is so low. I think there's a real opportunity that we could try and pull ahead of the pack here, and not only would it help us in terms of all the stuff we're facing in terms of safety challenges, but it could be of real benefit to the organisation in general in terms of its profile. And they did kind of listen, and then I literally got told, write me 2 sides of A4 and tell me what you think we need to advocate for, which was great and felt like a real breakthrough. But then the really difficult bit then was there was a bit of pressure to kind of just say, look, we need to get some kind of consultancy in to do loads of training, and and it was very much still, we need to get almost like the typical approach. Let's get somebody in and do loads of non-technical skill type training. That's what we need. So then there was a bit of a battle to kind of say, well, actually, that's not what really I think we need. We don't want to sheep dip people in training. What we're starting to need building is that we need to start actually building skills and using them. So that went on for some time, but kind of slowly there was kind of some NHS improvement money that appeared. But at that point, I left that post and went to another post in the organisation, and it almost got left hanging. But at the point I left that post, there was a business case that we'd started to pull together for additional kind of resource for patient safety, and I'd said, I think we need a dedicated HF&E post, and here's all the reasons why. And so it was still within that business case as I moved to a new post. And then somebody else took up that business case, and I think it probably went round in circles for another 12 months or so while I was in this other post. And then suddenly the business case just appeared and happened, and the resources started to be released, including an HF&E post that I'd written the job description for, which I'd ripped off the job description for a post that we used to have in the HSM. So it all just kind of appeared overnight, and some of it, I guess what I'm saying is, it felt like a lot of hard pushing, but then there was just a couple of really happy accidents along the way, like having that conversation with the NHS improvement director kind of opened a door, because they were quite influential at that point as well. So even with that, it still took another 18 months before that business case went through and that post was in that business case. So it kind of shows you how tough it can be. And I think the environment started to get just a little bit more receptive, but still really, really challenging. And I think what was interesting for me was probably, it was almost kind of a bit of having to take advantage of some of the chaos, because I think actually people didn't really understand about HF&E, and probably in their heads it was just all non-technical skills type stuff. So I kind of thought, well, let people believe that, but if that gets me a HF&E person that starts opening some other doors to build a bit more wider kind of capacity and make us think slightly differently, that's fine. People can think that. I may disagree, but that's a way to may potentially get things starting to move. And I guess while I was still in this post, before I came to my current post, Joe came into post as clinical lead for patient safety at that point. So Joe, clearly being an advocate for HF&E, you started to hear it from more than one source as well, I think, which was really helpful. But at that point, I think we'd already advertised for the post, hadn't we? So it was starting to build, but that's like 2.5 years of me being in the organisation before anything really happened. And like I say, I think if there wasn't a couple of just fortuitous things that happened, it may have been even longer. So I think that kind of shows you some of the difficulties that you have in terms of winning arguments, and it's difficult to win arguments. This sounds really pejorative, doesn't it? But it's true of anything, isn't it? It's true of me about a whole load of things, but it's difficult to win arguments with people who just have no real grasp of what you're trying to say. So if you don't really have insights already into what HF&E is and can be, it's very difficult to push an argument, because people who are busy are completely overwhelmed and under a huge amount of pressure. Getting any kind of airtime with them or getting them focused on that is very difficult if it's not even amongst a set of skills that they really appreciate, which I'm sure is true in most places. And it's a huge challenge in the NHS and healthcare in general, I guess, for HF&E, isn't it? So it was an interesting time, but it just felt like there was a couple of opportunities, and it just opened a door. And if you can open that door slightly, then maybe that's the way to start building things, but just accept it's going to be quite messy. unless you can find a real champion and advocate who understands what you're trying to say and is at quite a senior level. But that's probably fairly rare, which is not knocking NHS execs at all. I just don't think it's a skill set that people see that they should necessarily have either. So it was hugely challenging, and we just managed to nudge the door open, I think, didn't we?
Yeah.
But hard work.
A lot of persistence, a lot of patience, and as you said, chance conversations.
Yeah.
With the right people at the right time.
Yeah, completely. And I think, a lot of it is persistence, but also a lot of it was chance. I'd love to say it wasn't, but but you have to take advantage of those little opportunities when you get them, don't you?
And Joe, Pete's mentioned that you sort of came in almost towards the end when the post was being advertised. But I mean, you're a colorectal surgeon, so where did your interest in human factors come from?
Well, like all clinicians, my human factors initially came from the commercial organisations, the airline pilots that teach non-technical skills, and for a long time, like most of my colleagues in healthcare, I believe that human factors started and ended at HF, non-technical skills, and that because it's intuitively it's really, really attractive. If only we behave better, if only we do things a little bit differently, if only we train harder, then we won't make so many mistakes. There are problems with that, partly because it doesn't underline any of the address any of the underlying systems-based problems that we encounter at work, and it also means that if people can be lazy. We've trained you, you've made another mistake. Why have you made that mistake? Given that we've trained you. So I went on a couple of courses. Then I persuaded the trust to finance a masterclass from one of the commercial organisations, and we trained in depth in non-technical skills a number of clinicians. And then myself and Brenda Maxton, who was a patient safety advisor at the time, taught that course to the theatre team. But it didn't quite sit right to me, it didn't seem complete. So then I started doing a little bit of reading around the subject. I then approached our human resources director and managed to persuade her to release funds for myself and a physician to go on a postgraduate certificate in patient safety. And so we chose the Oxford course, where Lauren was currently director at the time. And in the meantime, I also had my eyes opened when I went to the white paper launch event at the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors in Birmingham at QE. And I heard Steve Tipper talk about an investigation on the neonatal ward. And he talked about all these systems-based approaches that he'd used and how he'd identified all these environmental and staffing and work-based and IT-based problems that he'd identified. And it just opened my eyes completely, because I was used to coming to it from a place where, there was a root cause, and that root cause was usually human error, to listening to a whole host of things demonstrating that actually, if you don't address those fundamental systems and processes and environmental factors, you're always going to get human error. From there, I started sort of exploring the internet, and I found that some really good webinars from NHS Education Scotland, run by Paul Bowie. I listened to all of those, and then started advocating more and more in the trust for human factors to be recognised a little bit better than just non-technical skills, which has been an uphill battle and continues to be so, because I think one of the problems we've got is that we can explore systems-based problems when we're doing investigation training, for example, but when you're a busy trust, and particularly a trust that's really under the pump, finding the time and space and the headspace to really do fundamental system-based improvements is really quite difficult, particularly when funding is tight and we're on a tight IT improvement journey and so on. So that's where it came from, and over time, my role has become more and more, I think, enjoyable and rewarding, because I now work with people who understand what we're talking about.
I think it's an interesting point that you. This is how it happens, isn't it? In organisations, you kind of meet people. I think I met Joe on my second. I was sat in Brenda Maxton's office, and you wandered in. So I met Joe on my second day in the trust, I think, or third, and I didn't have that much contact with you in between, I don't think. But then we kind of reconnected at the point I think I was just stepping out of my original role and had been trying to push all this, and started to realise there was we had a lot of common ground in terms of thinking about where we wanted safety to go, integrating human factors and ergonomics, and then we were having a lot of conversations. Me and Joe drafted a kind of suggestion of what a patient safety strategy for the organisation should look like, which included clearly, HF&E as a kind of cornerstone of that as well. So it's interesting how you kind of sometimes bump into people in organisations, don't quite appreciate that you're both on the same page, and then reconnect at a different point. So it all felt quite timely, really, and particularly Joe being in that clinical lead role, because it felt like it's not just me advocating for it, you've got the clinical lead for patient safety saying the same things as well. So it starts to, still difficult, but it starts to get you a bit more kind of airspace, doesn't it, and a bit more kind of exposure to senior people to advocate for stuff. So probably
I mean, certainly clinically, one of the frustrations for me is that in clinical medicine, HF&E still starts and ends at non-technical skills. There are very few clinicians that understand or advocate for systems-based change and learning, and certainly, not to single out particular specialties as much, but certainly our anaesthetic staff, our surgical staff do believe in non-technical skills. All the push nationally from the colleges is about non-technical skills. So obviously there's the NOTS course. There's a new course being set up in London College of Surgeons, which is all about non-technical skills, which I find immensely frustrating, because at the moment the national conversation amongst clinicians is about non-technical skills and not systems-based learning and systems-based improvement. And for me, until that changes and until doctors are starting to talk about it, because doctors are in an immensely privileged position in their ability to influence the conversations. So until that conversation changes, until SEEPs is a thing that people talk about day to day, instead of talking to somebody and they say, "What is SEEPs?" Until we change that, until we have that national conversation that's a little bit more mature than just about the non-technical skills, I don't think that we're going to get a huge way nationally anyway, and that I find quite frustrating.
Well, it's really interesting. So we have patient safety specialist webinars, so the network of patient safety specialists around the country, and they're hosted by Aidan Fowler, who's the director for patient safety. And there was one not so long ago, and it was Ken Catchpole talking about the work he does in HF&E and the work he's doing in the States. And I think it kind of illustrated this a little bit, because I put a question into the chat and just said, how does it feel from the States end in terms of how integrated HF&E is? Because from on this side of the Atlantic, I almost feel like it's a little bit more integrated there than it is here. And he kind of responded, well, it just depends where you go, doesn't it? It depends which organisation you're talking about. But the person who was kind of fielding the questions is the Deputy Director of Patient Safety, who does the kind of strategy side. And this is, once again, is not pejorative, but it's just really interesting, because I put this question in the chat basically saying, because it feels like we're still at least 30 years off here, even with a fair wind behind us, in terms of really trying to get to the point where HF&E is embedded and it's business as usual, or even approaching that. And he picked that question out to ask, but there was kind of he almost gave it a bit of a preamble that he was really sceptical about that question, as if somehow, well, actually, no, I feel like we are on a journey much quicker than that to get HF&E stuff embedded. which kind of showed to me a bit of a disparity between maybe what the view is nationally and what actually is really happening on the ground. And it feels like Scotland is kind of ahead of the curve compared to England, but it was just really fascinating to see that, because that was coming from like a national director, and once again that's not knocking that individual at all, but it just felt like he struggled with that question a bit, because it was almost like that's not what I perceive, but I think on the ground, if you're interested in HF&E stuff, that still seems to be where we are really. We're a long journey away from anywhere near the kind of embedding of HF&E in the same way as you've got in other industries.
I mean, I think we are on a slow journey, and we are making some progress. I mean, we're a few years away from when I went to see a number of our executive officers and started talking about HF&E, and they said, what is human factors? What is ergonomics? Ergonomics is all about height of a chair. So we're moving on. You were the chair lady, weren't you?
I was.
I think, but now, and certainly in our incident review meetings, the language has completely changed. I think there's been a lot of work done in training people in systems-based approaches. SEEPS is now embedded into our investigation training. There's been a lot of work done by Lauren and Sharon and Pete in training that and embedding that and redesigning our forms. So the language over the last couple of years has been on a bit of a journey from what this was an RCA, or well, you've done this investigation, but why are you talking about the computers, and why are you talking about the environment and the lighting, and so on and so forth, to an expectation that those will have been explored. And I think we are seeing that. I think the next step for us as an organisation is translating those findings into improvement programmes that don't necessarily fit nicely within one department or division and require oomph and push from at corporate level. And I think PSURF will help tremendously with that. At least I've got my fingers firmly crossed that it will do.
I think the lesson for me is, on the basis that it feels like we're still on the first baby step of an incredibly long and difficult journey, just to even get that first baby step, nothing's going to really happen until you have probably somebody on the ground who's got some of those skills, or you're working with people who have those skills, and like Lauren, for instance, and you start to weave some of those things in, and you can kind of start showing people this is how it affects your thinking, this is how it puts a different take on some of these incidents. Probably, you have, in some ways, maybe you do have to start with incidents. It'd be nice, wouldn't it, to think we're much more proactive and we're looking at systems before incidents happens. But you probably start with the incidents, don't you? And if you start to push that, but you've got some practical capacity on the ground, no matter how limited it is, at least you can start demonstrating some insight into what it means. Until you've got that, it's really esoteric for people, isn't it? And it's very difficult. So I think for people who want to start, you just have to try and find any way you can to try and get some of these skills in somewhere, even on the most limited basis, because until you've got that, it can be such an esoteric argument for a lot of people.
And getting funding is difficult sometimes as well, because certainly business cases, I was clinical director for 5 years, and we put a number of business cases in. It was all about how you were going to cost it. And it's often quite difficult to cost something like, well, if we have an ergonomics practitioner in our organisation who will drive quality improvement and therefore hopefully we'll see a reduction in safety incidents, that's very difficult to quantify. And it's also very difficult to quantify in cash terms. And so when you're presenting a business case, which is usually very finance driven and finance orientated, to a group of people for whom they have to justify every pound spent because money is tight, it's quite difficult to demonstrate the value of a nebulous concept like that. And we were very lucky that we managed to get that through, I think.
I agree entirely.
I think it's quite interesting reflecting on where the money comes from in the organisation from a HF post. So if you So in SAF, because the money came through the safety team, and Sharon, as the employed HF specialist, sits within that safety team, and when I support, I'm paid through that safety team. Then you have to do the work of that safety team. So you are doing investigations as the big push, and I think that in SAF we've made a big difference. The organisation has been working incredibly hard through the Freedom Speak Up work, through their culture work, but also with the HF work of changing the language around investigations, as you say, Jo, and slowly shifting that culture. And I think the staff are incredibly receptive to systems-based investigation when they've been involved in an incident, particularly when they're in an organisation where the culture has been, and in some places still continues to be, quite problematic. So, thinking about the work that I initially started with SAF is around maternity investigations, and those staff were incredibly receptive to having HF and systems-based investigations for their work, because they could see that it spoke to the challenges that they were experiencing in work, and we were able to make real change as a result of those investigations. Where, if I reflect on my time in Oxford, the money there for HF involvement in the trust didn't come through safety. So when I was in Oxford, I did do some investigation work through a research point of view, but largely the work there was around deteriorating patient. And so we did a lot of tech spin-out pieces of work where HF was really funded in. And so the organisation there had a different view of how HF would be involved in the organisation and the kind of things that a HF person could do in an organisation. And then if I reflect on West Suffolk, another organisation where I'm working with, lots of the work I've been doing there is through their new hospitals project. So there they can see a completely different role for a HF person. So in a way, each hospital is hiring a different kind of person, even though the skill set essentially is still HF. Actually, they're applying it to different areas of the organisation. So I think historically what we've seen is that those posts are held within those occupational health teams, as you were, Fran, but also in moving towards safety, and PSIF does give a massive opportunity for that. But I do think for Trust there are opportunities around new hospital programmes, around new IT programmes, where actually HF fits in really well, and they will be doing stuff, immediately have an impact in the organisation. So it's about where the opportunities are in that organisation, aren't they? And where the kind of pool of people that can support that framework of thinking, because in SAF it's very much in the governance team. Other teams are very much opening up to it, but that's where the home was. That's where Pete and Jo were sort of centred around. So for anyone coming in, that's going to be their natural home and natural where they're going to be most comfortable. So yeah, I think the so almost I remember having a conversation with you, Fran. We were sat in the Institute of Translational Medicine, and we were chatting, and I guess the kind of concept I had in my head, which was the one that I put into this 2 sides of A4 that I gave to this NHS improvement director, was almost like a pyramid. So I very much had this idea that there's no point in sheep dipping loads and loads and loads of people in HF training and thinking that's going to make a massive difference, but there is some validity in just trying to raise that general awareness for as many people as possible around some of those basic concepts around systems thinking, around work systems, all that kind of stuff, because it just starts to frame the issue a bit more, doesn't it? So you're just like, there's no point in just telling people to concentrate harder, there's no point in just thinking training is the solution to everything, because here's the complexity, and just getting people into that headspace. And then there was a bit in the middle, and I remember having this same conversation with you. Is there a set of people where you can build deeper insights, a slightly higher level of training, and maybe those people could potentially apply some of those systems type tools to their area, to an investigation, to a specific safety challenge, efficiency whatever it might be, and actually they're not qualified ergonomists, but you're supporting them and training them to the point where they can start to do like an FMEA or a hierarchical task analysis. And I still think there's some validity in that. But then there's got to be kind of towards the apex of the pyramid, the qualified person who knows their stuff and can support others, and you call on them to say, actually,
we really need your skills here either to support other people, or we need you to do the work. And I kind of feel that's where we've been trying to move, and that's where we kind of are going under PSURF as well, almost like how do you build that. And Lauren and Joe particularly started to try and develop an internal network of people who had a much deeper insight into HF&E, so they took people out for 5 days, so a much higher level of kind of, is training the word you want to use, or but I don't know if it is training anyway, but and also part of the thought process we had there was actually those people, hopefully they start to get fired up and enthused. Hopefully they do apply some of this stuff, though I do think that's still a challenge, isn't it? Because very often people get fired up, they go back into their job, they get buried and they don't apply it. But actually we start to build a group of people, and some of those people might be people who then want to go on and do an MSc, and that started to pan out.
Well, we've had, I think there's 4 people that did that piece of work who have gone on to do their master's piece of work, and those that haven't, and that's absolutely fine, it wasn't supposed to be a complete conversion into the masters, but those that haven't, so if we take one of the delivery suite coordinators in maternity as a case in point, so she came along, did the week's masters, and then they were talking about getting new CTG machines in the department, and she went, hang on a minute, I think we want to do some usability testing on these. And so we then had this piece of work which was really quick, really light touch. She said, do you fancy coming along for the day? So me and Sharon went along, we did some really quick usability testing on the machines, and really changed the dialogue over which machines were going to get used, really focusing on those kind of safety critical tasks that you want people to be using, stopping the salespeople kind of saying, oh, buy our shiny one, here's some nice freebies, and actually getting down to the bit of safety stuff that you really want to be doing within a trust. And I think maternity then had they had a good grasp of what HF was already, but that's a really good example of how a relatively modest investment in a team member can make a big difference in terms of how they are then using HF in their work. So she's gone on to do other projects so she keeps developing sort of different task and finish groups. We've done stuff around postpartum hemorrhage, we've done stuff around fetal monitoring training, and so HF is seeping into the organisation through that kind of development model that Pete and Joe came up with.
And I think probably even if there's an attrition rate, so from that network, even if however many people, I can't even remember how many people we've got, but even if some of those people do that, they get fired up, but they don't really apply it back into their area. Even if a percentage of those people go off and they apply it back, and you have these really tangible examples that other people in that department, in that system, in that pathway, however you describe it, can see, then that's what starts to seed this stuff more widely, isn't it? And they're also examples that you can play back to your senior leaders to say, well, actually, look, we invested in this, but here's some stuff that once again, potentially getting some of the impacts and outcomes, or trying to attach a cost to that is a price, a pound figure that can be really hard. But I think there will be a fall-off rate. But even if half of those people go off and do something, you're starting to... So it feels like the right thing to do.
And they have the support of a human factors specialist. I think that's the important thing, isn't it? And we've made reference to Sharon, who is the human factors specialist, who unfortunately can't be with us today. But we also have Lauren as well. Might be useful for Lauren, you to explain where you fit into this kind of rich picture of human factors.
Well, that is the $1 million question. It's interesting because when Joe and Pete were developing the post for human factors, and I think it was incredibly. I was really excited to see that Shrewsbury and Telford were developing that post, but it wasn't the right post for me at that time. That wasn't kind of where I was going. So I had a really open and frank discussion with the organisation that said, if you're going to employ a HF person and they're going to be largely on their own in terms of their own mentorship and stuff like that, really what you want is some scaffolding put around that to support that role. And so that was only supposed to be a short-term thing really that I was working with the organisation. But I have to say, I know it's my home organisation in terms of it's local to me where I live, but I love the organisation. I genuinely feel like it's such an open place to taking human factors ideas. I think, Pete, the point you make about an organisation that's under pressure is an organisation that also has opportunities. I feel like that's completely true for human factors. I feel like when people are struggling, HF does have something to bring to them. It's not, whereas perhaps other improvement kind of methodologies can feel like it adds more pressure to those staff. I feel like HF gives them it explains the real word to them, and you're understanding how they're doing their work. You know, that concept of work as done being central to human factors feels real to those staff. So what I do is support Sharon in her role as much as she doesn't really need it, but I'm there to help. But largely, I think the bit that I really enjoy for SAF is the bit that I do outside SAF actually, which is the having the voice nationally, which I'm lucky enough to have. So when I was doing the work with NHS England about the oversight framework, I was able to take the opinion of SAF and the experience of SAF and take that to the national picture with conversations that we're having around new, curriculum development, around the patient safety syllabus, stuff like that. Again, it's SAF's voice that's at that table then, because that's my working experience of being within that trust. And I think that's really, really important when you look around the table, the kind of organisations that are represented there, you don't tend to get a rural district general hospital, and that's what we've got in SAF. And so I think it's really, really important that voice continues to be taken to the table and they get given the respect that they deserve. So I think that there's also a challenge with being that kind of slight outsider in an organisation, but I do think it brings with you, and I've reflected with the team quite a lot about how I don't feel frightened for my job, so I'm able to speak up because I know if they turn around and say, Lauren, you stepped out of line, it's fine, I've got other work. So I feel I have the freedom in my role to push human factors in a way that if I was a full-time employee, I don't think I would be able to do. So I have had some quite difficult conversations with some quite senior, the most senior people within the organisation. They were completely open, and in no way has anyone ever threatened me. But I think I felt able to do that because I sit in this dual position. So I think for HF people, I've been having some dialogue about the kind of ethical dilemmas of human factors, in that what you're often discovering, particularly in when you overlap with a bit of governance, is areas of work that make you feel uncomfortable. And you want to be able to escalate those, and being able to escalate those if you have to go through lots of hierarchy can be quite challenging. So I think there's something about my character there that means that I'm going to be happy having those conversations, but there's also something about not being afraid to do that, because I have alternative employment that is quite challenging for some people actually when they are a fully employed HF person.
The thing that strikes me, and it'd be interesting to see what you guys think about this, as in human factors and ergonomics, people who've worked in healthcare. Who was it? Somebody said, it came up on Twitter, didn't it? Maybe it was Ken Catchpole, I can't remember anyway. Somebody said on Twitter, this was many years ago, kind of said, human factors and ergonomics will change healthcare, but healthcare will change human factors and ergonomics as well. And I don't know, as a it kind of feels that way to me, because it almost feels like, and this isn't trying to make excuses, but it does feel like there's a level of complexity in healthcare that is kind of beyond other human endeavours almost, which is not saying that other places aren't complex and difficult, but and because we don't have that track record of human factors and ergonomics being kind of embedded in the way it is in other places, it feels like there's got to be flexibility. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and challenge me if that's not true, but it feels like, if you start to embed human factors and ergonomics in healthcare, it will impact on the whole science and thinking of human factors and ergonomics to me. But that's the way it should be, isn't it? But I guess the thing that I've definitely learnt is, which probably goes back to my point about naivety, whether it happens anywhere, but you never get anything by revolution in the NHS, do you? It's all by evolution. And I kind of thought maybe we could stage a mini revolution, but it was entirely the wrong thing to think, and just doesn't fit with the experience and culture of healthcare or the NHS, I don't think. But that point about just getting your foot in the door is the key one, isn't it? I think frustrating as it. Maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right, Pete. I think it is an evolution rather than a revolution. We are on a journey. We are now talking about systems-based thinking. We are talking, it's now embedded into our investigation training. PSURF is coming, which will make a difference, because obviously there'll be quality improvement streams which will require systems-based thinking, and I think that's going to accelerate the learning of organisations in developing those. I think they'll start to recognise the value of HFE expertise, because they're going to have to sort of buy it in, really, aren't they? It's a bit like like clinical revolutions, in terms of like when we went from open surgery to laparoscopic surgery. We had to develop those skills and buy them in. So trust brought in people who could do it, to develop it. And it may well be that we'll see that over the next 24 months or so, as people suddenly realise, PSURF is actually really quite big. We're going to have HFE expertise there. I think from our point of view, we are on that way, because we're having those conversations now. But it is interesting, because of course there are pockets of the organisation where it doesn't necessarily reach where it ought to reach, and there are places like, for example, estates, where they haven't necessarily been encouraged to, or joined in with those conversations, and it's really, really fundamental. I mean, where, for example, you put the toilet roll holder in a patient toilet is really, really important. And one thing that I heard, which I think is a great thing, the term hippo, which is the highest paid person's opinion in a room, always seems to hold sway. And it's true, because actually, an architect may design a toilet, but if you don't ask the HCA who's going to take the patient to the toilet, how they use the toilet and how a patient uses the toilet, they're going to get it wrong. And we have examples where they have got that wrong in our organisation. Very recently with a modular ward, and it's a lovely space to be in as a patient, but it could have been better. And if they'd asked Lauren and I to look at the plans at an earlier stage, we could have avoided some of the problems that they're now having to deal with. We've got an opportunity now, because of course we're undergoing some major building work in the future, and hopefully we'll be allowed in to sort of comment on and make changes to the plans with staff and patients in mind. Because you can ask a consultant surgeon how they want their ward to be, but how often does a consultant surgeon actually spend significant time on the ward? It's very, very rare. The people who are on the ward are the people doing the work, are the nurses, the HCAs, the porters, the cleaners, and the junior doctors, and the catering staff. So we should be asking them how they want their ward built, designed. And I think that all the way through the organisation, looking at every single improvement project that you do, is key to getting a happy organisation. And it's a bit difficult to measure, because at the end of the day, when you can't measure in terms of, well, we've got better staff satisfaction, we've got better staff retention, we've got fewer staff sick days. Those are the things that we should be looking at. But they're going to take. It's going to be almost a mini generation before those things become clear. And unfortunately, when we have a short-termism approach, which I suppose is kind of necessary, when you've got ambulances parked outside your organisation and problems with discharging patients who are medically fit for discharge, and the chaos that ensues, it's very difficult to find the headspace to think about that. Well, actually, you know what? In 5 years' time, we want to be aiming for our staff survey to look better. We want our staff retention to look better. We want our staff sickness to reduce. We want our safety incidents to reduce or change in nature. That is difficult for people to see when they're battling with a bed occupancy rate of over 100%.
I think the biggest thing for me, and the biggest set of lessons that I've learned recently, and we were talking about this before, is if you do a really big piece of HF type work, is don't underestimate the challenge of trying to convert that insight into improvement on the ground. And I think there's got to be a lot of thinking about how we, and I think sometimes there's been a bit of a, I'm going to use my words wisely here. I really value quality improvement type approaches, having that structured approach to delivering change. You need that. But sometimes that's almost felt a little bit cult-like in some places. So there's a balance to be struck there. But I think if you can really start to link your HF type stuff in with quality improvement cycles, then that could really start to really deliver some benefits. But the thing that's really kind of been interesting is, so we did, well, I say we, Sharon mainly did a lot of work around the deteriorating patient. So essentially what we did was we looked at literature, we studied 2 years worth of serious incidents and framed all the findings from those under the SEEPS framework, and then Sharon spent a huge amount of time out and about on medical and surgical wards, observing, talking to people, trying to understand the work is done, capturing stuff under an observation tool. And it gave us this really kind of rich insight into the challenges that people had in terms of managing the deteriorating patient. And you started to see stuff under all those SEEPS categories. So tasks were poorly designed, communication between teams was really difficult, really simple stuff like bleep systems and how they work, tools and technology, so really interesting stuff about the system we use to capture news scores. If you go and look at that piece of kit, it only shows you the last news score, and then to find the trend for that patient, if you're a junior doctor, say, you have to go off and find another screen to get into a system called Portal to go and see the overall trend. So you could see all these things in the system. The really harsh lesson there is, I think, that we've learned so much from that, and we can do that kind of thematic look a lot better next time. Though I think we did a really good job the first time round, trying to convert that into a really structured quality improvement program, which is probably 2 to 3 years, if not more, worth of focused work, was incredibly difficult. One, because I just don't think we had the processes and almost like a pathway of how do you convert that insight into an agreed improvement program, where you've got the quality improvement structure, you've got the program management type structure behind it, and people are signed up to a longer term program that you try and track and deliver. But also, actually, that's the challenge with systems stuff, isn't it? It pushes you into a space which is the right space to be in, but it starts to beg really difficult questions around resource, priority, avoiding the quick fix that seems attractive, but trying to actually get to the nub of what can we change in the system that we think will reduce risk. And that is a really challenging place to get to. I think it's where we have to get to. But we've really struggled to convert all that insight into, and we're slowly now starting to get into a process where we're moving into how do we define the improvement program behind that. I think PSURF's going to be a bit of a lever there, because that's kind of what PSURF asks you to do. But I think that's going to be a massive challenge for organisations, even organisations who have a bit of HF&E insight, support from a Laura and a Sharon on the ground, people who kind of aren't qualified but have some insight and are passionate about it. That really linking into longer term systems improvement programmes, we just generally don't do well. So there's got to be some thinking, I think, about how we link that HF&E and that QI. It's almost like we've got two camps at the moment, and we need to kind of try and bring them together a bit more. And actually sometimes people on the QI side don't necessarily appreciate the value of the HF&E stuff really as well. So there's a lot of
I think they feel that they've got their expertise and they feel a little bit challenged sometimes.
But to me, it's almost like, if you take that model for improvement and your kind of PDSA cycle type thinking, the bit that feeds into your P is all the stuff you're getting from understanding from HF&E, isn't it? And it's helping you to what is it you are trying to make different that you think will reduce risk, help people to work better, help people to do their jobs more effectively, help people not to burn out. That's where the kind of link is to me. And then you've got a structured way of doing that, testing it, measuring the impact, getting the feedback from people about, did that make your job better? Did that make that easier? All that. So it does link into that classic QI thinking, I think. And I think if we can kind of link those two things together, we'll stand a better chance of delivering change on the ground.
And I think the bit that's really interesting with the link with QI is kind of that the risk reduction methodologies that are in HF that are really rarely used in healthcare. So you kind of, people will be familiar with the terminology of failure modes and effects analysis and all of those kind of tools, but they're really not widely used, not widely communicated, and for when you are making change within the healthcare organisation, actually de-risking your first change is massively, massively important, because if you get it wrong, it's people's lives at the end of it. So I think, I'm very minded of a conversation I had with a neurosurgeon whilst I was working in Oxford, and he goes, I just can't experiment because the risks are just too high. So I need you to give me your best guess of what the solution is, because I can't cycle this through to get to where I need to be. So what tools do you have to de-risk it? And I said, well, actually, I've got a whole load in the toolbox. And we did it. And we did it in a kind of simulated way, so that the first time that it hit the ward, it was the safest that we could possibly make it. And I feel like as we get through to, don't just put the HF bit at the start of PSIRF, put it at the end as well when you're thinking about your change projects. How do you de-risk those changes for your organisation? What are all of your unintended consequences, and get those out? Because I think there's a risk in the programme that we spend a long time doing the HF on the first bit, but then hand it over. And I think we can add some to the end. I do think reflecting on Sath's journey, when PSIRF is kind of coming down the road at the speed that it's coming on, the work that you guys have done and that I've been lucky enough to be involved in, I just think it puts the organisation in such a strong place for PSIRF, because the language that's in use amongst the whole of the organisation, the kind of culture that has been driven by the change in leadership that we've had. We've got a very good medical director, chief nurse at the moment, who are very fluent in the concepts of human factors and the importance that it brings to the organisation. And I think that that piece of work around human factors in that organisation just means that PSIRF should, she says, touching wood, be slightly easier to implement, given the groundwork that's there. And I because of the other work that I do, I see other organisations, and I think where you haven't had that investment in ergonomics and human factors, and it is all brand new, that's quite an uphill struggle to get some of the PSIRF stuff implemented. So if the first time you're seeing SEEPs is the first time you're opening the PSIRF guidance, that's a big piece of work. Whereas your organisation is now so fluent in it that we should be able to run with it at speed.
I think that point you just made is a really good one, because I think the point where the penny kind of dropped for me in terms of HF&E stuff was a programme we did at Birmingham Children's Hospital, which was based around this health foundation thing called Safer Clinical Systems. So we looked at depth, and this was like 2 years worth of work. So we looked at depth at the whole way that handover worked, in terms of it was like 13 medical teams handing over to a single hospital at night team, and we redesigned all that in terms of safety and etc. And actually, we did get support from external HF&E people, but we kind of did get thrown out there in some ways, because we were asked to do before and after kind of FMEA hierarchical task analysis, look at the system, understand where all your hazards and risks are, then redesign it and do it again. And we had to produce a kind of really rudimentary safety case for it and stuff like that. And I think if I look back at how we did that now, I'd probably be completely horrified and feel like, we should have had a lot more support from a Lauren or a Sharon or a Fran. We did get some, but actually, because it was the first time we'd ever used these tools, but I think even just using some of those tools in a rudimentary fashion put us in such a different place to understanding our system, and then particularly when we introduce the changes, understanding where some of the potential hazards still were, and where trying to kind of really think about the unintended consequences of what we were doing, just put us in a totally different place. And if we did that all again now, I'm sure if I was involved, we'd try to approach it very differently, and you would try to embed those skills much more. But the fact that we had a bit of support and we did it and we used some of those tools and that insight did put us in a completely different place. And that was when the penny started to drop for me, because we were looking at the whole work system, and I was like, oh, right, now I'm starting to kind of understand. But yeah, so, and that was pretty rudimentary the way we did it, but even doing it in a rudimentary fashion was way up the evolutionary ladder compared to probably how we would have done it previously.
It's still a valuable piece of work.
I'm not saying we shouldn't aspire to more, but and the fact that we did kind of try to check before we introduced, do we think we're introducing the most well-designed solution we can at this point? Probably saved us a lot of grief. But that's really made me think about that point that Lauren's just made about how you use it in both contexts, and then you can link it to the kind of QI cycle, as in what you're about to test, we think, in terms of on paper, and maybe we've done a bit of simulation, or we've gone and tested it a few times in a controlled way. Is this the safest thing we think we can do with this work system? And then introduce it, and you're introducing it in a more controlled fashion. That's
So what next for the post? The post has been in for a couple of years. Is it maybe a bit longer?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see it ever disappearing.
That's good.
I think it's proved its worth. I mean, that work that Sharon did on a deteriorating patient was really, really valuable, and I see it as being fundamental to the way that we're going to embed PSURF in the organisation. We have a quality improvement team that use some, but not all of the sort of principles of HF that we would recognise. I think they're very lean orientated at the moment, which is one tool, but not all of the tools. And I think Sharon, as she's developing her experience and her insight, is actually going to be invaluable in the quality improvement side of work. I think there's some work streams with PSURF. Obviously we have to identify our quality improvement streams that are trust priorities over the next 3 or 4 years. Deteriorating patient, I'm sure, will be one of those, and with her insight, if she's not involved in that, then it's not going to work. I don't think so. I'm very hopeful that the post is proving itself, and it will continue to prove itself. I mean, at the end of the day, as a clinician, I can only dip in and out of it because I've got a busy clinical role, and so I'm very much part time. What I think I bring is a little bit of clinical insight to the team, but I also provide that Bolshi consultant surgeon voice.
Do you?
But I think that's really important. Because as I said before, we sit in as a very privileged position as a consultant, and if I can use that voice to say, actually, you need to listen to these guys. These guys are the experts. These are the people who are going to make it better. I've got enough understanding to say that, but I don't have the time to do that work myself. Is really, really important. I think for what I would say for any aspiring HFE professional wanting to go into healthcare is, if you join an organisation, identify your clinical champion early, because if you don't do that, you're going to feel very isolated when you start making clinical, trying to make changes to clinical work. So that's what I would definitely try and do. And if there's one there already on the interview panel, you're very lucky.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice.
I agree actually. And if I think about the organisations that I've worked most closely with, the person within those organisations is that clinical lead that has become actually, if I reflect on the organisations, they've become my friends in those organisations, and really good friends actually. And to Joe's surprise, I probably count him among that as well. But you know, that is a
that
privilege.
surprises me.
But I think
I've got a friend.
just the one. But I think, yeah, that clinical person who really understands HF, who can have your back in an organisation and can put you into situations that might feel uncomfortable at first, but they've seen the opportunity that's there. That's really helpful. And when you come up against I guess the other thing that I would say, and to kind of make Pete blush as well, is a bit of organisational memory. So in an organisation like SAF and in many others that I've worked in, there's bear pits and they are deep and they're quite scary. And so you need to know where they are. And so by having someone who knows the organisation, knows where some of the challenges have been before, so that not that you don't go there, but you're going there with your eyes wide open and you know who's going to likely be helpful to you. I think that's incredibly helpful. So someone with an address book and knows everyone, so Pete will know everyone within the organisation that I want to speak to. And then if I want a point made or I need someone to go and advocate for me, then Joe's the person that I'm calling. So you kind of want that balance of person in your organisation.
I think if I was kind of a qualified HF&E person and I was going into a post that had been created in an NHS organisation, it was the first time I'd worked in health. I talked to people first who'd done it, you know, the Frans, the Laurens, the Sharons, who really kind of just go and talk to people who've particularly if you're going into, well, any trust, but an acute trust, go and just talk to people and try and get a bit of an unvarnished view of how rewarding it can be, but also how challenging it can be. I'd also say, I'd talk to the people, you know, if you're applying for it, say if somebody does advertise, they want a HF&E qualified person, talk to the people who are recruiting you and ask them and try and understand if they have some basic insights into HF&E. And if they don't, this sounds awful, doesn't it? I'm not trying to discourage people, but just be really careful, because I think there might be a temptation that people start to think we need human factors people and start to advertise posts, but it's almost because they've just got it into their head, we do need these people, but they don't really know what they're actually looking for. So I'd kind of talk to people and just say, you know, what is it you're looking for? What do you understand by these terms? And just be really careful, because people are saying, oh, well, you know, human factors is kind of non-technical skills and stuff like that. Are you going into an environment where even the immediate few people around you are going to support you? And you could end up in a very difficult situation, couldn't you? That could be very frustrating. So just be... But I'd talk to people who've done it as well. Clearly there's a few out there, isn't there? But you guys know how tough it can be. But I think, you know, if you get somebody who says, I'm not a qualified H&V person, but this is, you know, what I think ergonomics is about, and they start to say stuff that you think, I can really recognise that, then maybe you've got somebody there who's your advocate, your support.
And I think it's really, really important to remember that you can have some really good allies and really good advocates in an organisation. They don't have to be qualified HF people.
No, absolutely,
But as Lauren said, it's finding, you know, who are the people that are going to direct you to the right people to speak to, who is your champion, and actually seek those out quite early on.
And I think, you know, when I first started at Oxford, I thought I understood healthcare, having had a father that had spent a long time in an acute hospital after having quite a serious incident. I was so naive. I didn't know what the inside of a hospital was. And when the research project that I was first working on meant that I had to spend hours and hours and hours observing operations, you know, observing over 500 operations, that is a lot of hours in the operating theatre, and then the same on a ward. What that gave me in terms of understanding of healthcare systems was just invaluable. So I think for people going into a healthcare organisation, even if you've worked in healthcare, spend some time observing. You know, that piece of work that Sharon was doing, yes, very important in terms of deteriorating patient and collecting that data, but also intensely important in getting her to enabling her to understand what the organisation smells and feels like. And that's really, really important when you're then in meetings outside the clinical environment, that you know that that ward's got a particularly difficult area or whatever it might be. That's critical, because I think come into human factors in healthcare not understanding hospitals and other healthcare spaces at your peril, because it is really, that bit about complexity. I think other industries might rival healthcare on its complexity, but what they won't rival healthcare on is their lack of control. So healthcare is very uncontrolled. It will do weird and wonderful things daily and evolve daily, whereas you don't get that in nuclear, you don't get that in oil and gas. Everything is very written down, the procedure happens that way every time, with a bit of variation, but it's that variety, lack of control element that healthcare has, that doubled with the complexity, that just makes it a really challenging place but a really, really exciting, rewarding place to work. Like, there's a reason everyone wants to come and listen to the healthcare stuff at the conference, isn't there? Because it is, it's good.
And I think each of you has given some really key advice, really useful, practical advice for anybody who's looking to actually try and start an HF post, but for people who are potentially coming in to fill those posts. So I think that's a brilliant place to finish. Thank you for ending on a positive with some practical advice. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.